Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Today's topic is Syria. However, before we start with this topic, I would like to refer to the situation in Israel. With me in the studio to discuss the different topics are our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'd like also to welcome Professor Ofra Bangio, a research fellow at Tel Aviv's University's Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies. Welcome. And I'd like to start with a question to you, Amir, regarding the situation in Israel. Give us a little bit the understanding of how is the dynamic truly evolving right now? What are the key issues at play?
Well, Israel, of course, has undergone many periods of crisis, many wars and campaigns throughout its 67-year history. But apparently, we are in a unique situation over the last couple of weeks because all of a sudden there is a breakout of knife wielding and other sorts of attacks by Palestinian youth in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and within Israel proper. People throughout Israel all of a sudden feel unsafe, insecure. The government seems to be out of control. There is no central authority blocking this phenomenon, and there is the sense that something must be done. What is to be done? People are at a loss to say, because central authority is not really at the center of this crisis, neither on the Palestinian side nor on the Israel side. One may say that the vertical lines, chains of command that we have been used to have been replaced by horizontal lines, social media and the like, because we used to call these perpetrators lone wolves. But how many lone wolves does it take to make a pack or to make a phenomenon? So as we are speaking now, Israel is in a sense of crisis. People are in a fight or flight mode, would rather stay home. Some of the streets are emptier than usual, and there is growing polarization between the Arab and Jewish citizens of Israel.
Mm-hmm. Professor Bangio, when it comes to the current situation in Israel, is this somewhat particularly Israeli Arab issue right now, where this, as we hear, has due to consequences of the power diffusion, where Facebook and other platforms of social media have received power that government doesn't really have control over, which assists basically the certain lone wolves, or however you want to call them, in being brainwashed or maneuvered into those kind of attacks? Or is it in a larger scale of a regional problem where this is a direct link from the Arab Spring of the late 2010, 2011?
It's a combination of the two. Because on the one hand, this is you can call it a third intifada, or the beginning of a third intifada, where we can call it the intifada of the knives, where individuals are starting to try, to attack people. Mainly, the main point, in their opinion, is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where the Jews are trying to destroy the Aqsa Mosque and to build instead the Israeli temple, the Jewish temple. This is on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's also a reflection of the intifadas or the Arab Spring in all the other places, and especially, I would say, maybe not the Arab Spring, but what's going on, what they have seen, what they have been seeing in Syria and in Iraq with Al-Qaeda, with ISIL, where they see, people taking knives and killing people by killing them by knives, by other ways. So this is a kind of infection which they imitate, and even in Israel, those who are imitating the youth in the West Bank also are having effect on the Palestinians or the Arabs of Israel, where we have seen two occasions where Israeli Arabs have also imitated.
Mr. Oren, I will want to give you a last sentence before we move on to the last topic, to the next topic, Syria. But before that, how is this actually affecting not only Israel, but the region? When we're talking about the situation, of course, it affects in a certain way the stability of Israel. What can you tell us about that?
There is a delayed action effect, and one cannot predict this week whether in 1 month or half a year we will see the consequences. And this is because this very crisis is also partly the result of what happened a few months ago in the village of Duma, when Israelis murdered an entire family by fire. And initially, right after this crime, there was no strong Palestinian reaction. People were surprised at how weak the response was. But it turned out that the shockwave is hitting us now. So we will have to wait and see. But obviously, Israel's deterrence has been eroded, because if Israel cannot take care of several knife-wielding youth, people might get the idea that it can be provoked on other fronts, and it weakens Israel's security situation.
Hold that thought. We'll talk now on the Syrian topic, as Russia's entry into the conflict in Syria has brought about a new reality in which, on the one hand, international players have voiced stronger interest in finding a political solution to the conflict, while on the other hand, they accused Russia of targeting rebels fighting President Bashar Assad's regime, which has brought the Syrian army to achieve gains in various locations of the war-torn country. We also can see a new reality where or a new old reality where also Israel cannot really enter and respond to fire being shot from the Syrian conflict into Israeli territory. Just this week, 3 mortar shells were fired towards Israel. Israel usually used to use its aerial superiority in the region, which is now, due to the Russian intervention, not as strong, using our artillery instead. How does this dynamic actually play out?
Well, you are referring to an incident which took place Tuesday, and it was very interesting because initially the Israeli Defense Forces spokesman referred to it as just another incident of quote-unquote leakage of fire being exchanged between the various factions on the other side of the border, and because of the proximity and the lack of accuracy, some of the shells landed in Israeli territory. So the official spokesman tended to belittle the importance of this incident. But sometime later, an artillery fire came from Israel into not only Syrian territory, but positions of the Syrian army. And the official statement by Israel referred to the Syrian army as being responsible for what is happening from its territory, even though people know and have known for the last 4.5 years that Bashar Assad and his army do not control everywhere, and it might have well been fired against the Syrian army, this particular barrage.
This is actually very interesting when it comes to the terminology used by this statement. The IDF spokesperson's unit noted that the IDF views the Syrian army as solely responsible to any attacks emanating from its territory. Does this mean that Israel actually still sees Syria with its borders as under the pure jurisdiction of the Assad regime?
I don't think so, because it makes a different. I think it has some connections also with the opposition in that part of the northern border where Assad has no control. So Israel is very flexible, trying to not to take really any strong say, but try to find its way between the opposition on the one hand and the regime on the other. But in the longer run, maybe it sees that the best way is for Assad to stay, so that there will be some power in this vacuum.
The odd aspect of this statement that Professor Bangio and yourself referred to is that it was a cut and paste job taken from another front altogether. Whenever a rocket is launched against Israel from the south, from Gaza, it could be by Palestinian Islamic Jihad or by some other faction, Israel comes out with a statement that Hamas is responsible and accountable for whatever happens from territories in Gaza, because ostensibly all of these territories are under its control. Mm-hmm. And here, all of a sudden, even though even if Assad really wants to refrain from any fire towards Israel, he is powerless to do it. If he could control these factions, he would have been glad to be the ruler of the entire territory of Syria once again, which of course is powerless.
This is actually very interesting when it comes also to the delegation from Russia that came here under the command of the Deputy Chief of Staff from Russia, who met also with the Deputy Chief of Staff of Israel. Does this actually mean that the process of developing what Netanyahu referred to as a coordination mechanism to put in place for Israel's involvement, or not involvement, but intervention in Syria once red lines are passed, is this not there yet? Does this exist?
Israel's place in what is happening vis-a-vis ISIL, the Islamic State in Syria, is unique. At first, it was the silent partner in the 60-nation coalition led by the United States. Many other countries took part in the fighting itself, mostly from the air, Arab countries, Western countries, but Israel did not, because just as was the case 25 years ago in Iraq, the United States did not want Israel to be part of or a visible part of the coalition, which could have caused friction there. But Israel did give intelligence and help in other ways. Now comes the Russian part, and the Americans are coordinating with the Russians via Skype. They are doing it by secure video conference. They have not met yet on the military level. The ministers of defense, or the Secretary of Defense and the Minister of Defense, spoke on the phone, but then the professional level only spoke on VC, on video conference. The Israelis, however, have met once, initially, the meeting that you are referring to, with the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Russian General Staff coming over, and then he invited his counterpart, General Yair Golan, to come to Moscow. So Israel is much further ahead than the others in coordinating with the Russian military because of the need for deconflicting what is happening in the Syrian airspace.
Is there a place here for Israeli brokerage of coordination between the United States and Russia?
Well, they don't need it, and they have been parties to the chemical arms agreement 2 years ago in the summer of 2013. They don't need Israel and to broker. It's mostly a domestic political issue, especially as we are entering the presidential year, because President Obama does not want to seem to be playing second fiddle to Vladimir Putin, but in reality, they have a division of labor on the ground in Syria.
Professor Bangio, how do you view this situation?
I think that what we are seeing is a sudden change in the geostrategic situation in the Middle East. Russia is turning to the Middle East after 25 years, after the collapse or the end of the Cold War, and what has happened in the Gulf War, which weakened extremely Russia. And now, all of a sudden, Russia is coming with great force. It starts in Syria, but I think it has also the idea to move also towards Iraq. And we know we are seeing that there is a coordination between the four forces, namely Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Russia. This is a very important development in the region to show that the vacuum which the United States somehow is leaving, because it's not really acting very forcibly or effectively. So this vacuum is being filled with Russia, and this might have a long-term implications for the whole region, for the excesses that are going to happen, to develop, and for of course the relationship, for example, between Turkey and Russia. We did not mention Turkey, but this is a very important development.
Definitely.
Turkey and the United States are the main losers from this development. Turkey is quite tight in its hand. It cannot do too much. Russia has tried to enter into the airspace of Turkey and Turkey did not react. 3 times they made it, and Turkey did not react. And I think Turkey, as the United States, are in deep dilemma how and what to react towards Russia.
I actually have a very specific question on the matter when it comes to Russian interest. President Vladimir Putin has stated this week that Russia is not looking to become the leader of the coalition against the Islamic State and the other terrorist groups, quote unquote, in the region. Nonetheless, at the same time, on a daily basis, the entire U.S. coalition fires half or targets half the aerial strikes conducted within Syria compared to the Russians. Is this a vocal statement at the same time, also a more proper statement by the Russians on the matter? Where are the Russians standing here?
I think that the Russians has many targets here. First of all, to empower Assad again, to empower themselves in the region, to be the leader of attacking ISIL, because it will help them both in Iraq and in Syria. And in general, to be, again, as I said, the main leader in the region. He has the hegemonic, targets, just as Erdogan has it. But in my opinion, in the longer run, yes, he is now the winner. But in the longer run, he might be in another quagmire. He might be pushed to send boots on the ground, and this will, complicate situation for the Russians.
Mr. Oren, I'd like to hear your also opinion on the matter, but also how do you see right now with the turning point of the conflict, where the Syrian army, which is still loyal to President Bashar Assad, has gone on a big campaign to reclaim territories lost, and of course now under Russian aerial support. Does this mean that the Syrian regime of Bashar Assad will gain a certain foothold within the equation of a political solution in the future, even though Western countries state over and over again that they're not willing to get there?
We tend to overlook facts of history and of geopolitics, which then come back to haunt us. Right after World War II, the Turkish ambassador to Washington died when he was on duty there. His coffin was taken by an American warship back home to Turkey. This warship stayed there, and this was the beginning of the Sixth Fleet. This is how the Americans entered the Mediterranean and stayed forever. The Soviets, who were closer to the Mediterranean, have reacted belatedly with their Mediterranean fleet. And this was one of the major friction points during the Cold War. And as Professor Bangio said, for the last 25 years, it was dormant. But they still have their interests. They have fired missiles from the Caspian Sea. They wanted to show how close they are. And they have their naval units in Latakia or Tartus in Syria. The Russians, or earlier the Soviets, have always backed the Syrian regime. And again, we tend to forget because it was so long ago. But in 1983, the Americans bombed Syrian positions in Lebanon. One of their pilots, Goodman, was a prisoner of war. And then the Russians brought surface-to-air missiles, SA-5 missiles, and it was a point of friction during the Cold War. What we see here is another show of, first of all, Russian insistence that they will not let the Assad regime fall. They may replace Bashar Assad himself, but they will not let this regime fall. And they will compromise only when there is the appearance of some stabilization. Now, the Syrian army cannot really win, even with Russian firepower, cannot win over the Islamic State. And what is the meaning of victory? Just one show of force will not help because you have to sustain it over time. However, if there is the appearance of a military achievement, then the parties can go to the table and get some sort of compromise where there will be a sort of a national unity government, let's say, with an Assad president and one of the rebels as prime minister. They will have some sort of setup that the major powers will be giving, behind the scenes, will be giving support to.
Professor Bangio, when it comes also to two players, which you mentioned one of them before, Turkey and the Kurdish Peshmerga and the Kurds in the region, who are enemies of one another, but at the same time they have a mutual interest when it comes to that territory. We could, of course, see this week's heinous attack of two terrorist bombs that were planted within a crowd of protesters during a mass rally. How does this dynamic play out between those two players when it comes to the Syrian conflict?
Well, the Kurds are now, at the crossroad because on the one hand, the United States does not give them enough support, neither for the KRG nor the PYD or YPG in Syria. But on the other hand, Russia is trying also to enter and to support them. I think the KRG would have preferred to remain on the western, with the United States, but on the other hand, the United States is afraid to give the support, direct support to the Kurds because it will enhance the disintegrity of the state. So the Kurds of Iraq are in a dilemma, and the same is also true for the YPG. But we are hearing that they are trying to, it is in a way more natural for the YPG to get the support of Russians because this is a Marxist-Leninist party. But on the other hand, on the ground, it is more convenient for them to have the Americans. The Americans, for example, do not allow their leader to enter the United States because he is considered a terrorist. So you see, the Kurds are really in a very great dilemma, and I think it will take time until they decide, or the powers decide for them where to go and how to go.
Well, we've heard President Putin from Russia state over and over and over again the legitimacy of the Kurdish people within the fight against terror, within the constellation of Syria right now, of course, in the future, as you said, that might also extend towards Iraq.
Yeah, but on the other hand, he does not want them to reach the sea. He wants them to have some limited support, to give them some limited support, because throughout these 4 years, they were not against Assad. They were, in a way, neutral to what was happening. So Russia wants them to stay there as a strong power, or not strong enough to endanger Assad.
With regard to the Turkish aspect of things, Mr. Oren?
Well, one shouldn't look at it, first of all, in a linear or Western fashion. First of all, it makes perfect sense in the Middle East for two organizations who should be working in the same direction to be at each other's throats. You had Amal and Hezbollah representing the Shiites in Lebanon, but fighting each other, as were Fatah and Hamas representing the Palestinians in Israel and in the West Bank and Gaza, and fighting each other. So Turkey and the Kurds could be something of an alliance on one sense, and fighting each other again. And of course, Russia has historically been the enemy of Turkey, which is one reason why Turkey was such a member of NATO, because it needed the support of a Western alliance behind it against the Russians. Also, one shouldn't consider the Russians and the Americans as equivalent. The Americans have their hands tied by legal and congressional and political constraints. They cannot fire indiscriminately. Earlier, you cited the data regarding the tonnage of the bombs the Russians dropped and the Americans. The Americans must have some controllers on the ground. They must have a real explanation for any strike that they have, especially when they have collateral damage and they hit innocents. For the Russians, this is not really important. They do what Putin is saying, and they don't worry about the public relations image of it.
But in my opinion, Obama's, policy is the main problem here, because he does not want to send boots on the ground. He wants to finish his term without too much being involved in the region. And this is the main point. It's not because the Congress does not allow him to do things. It's his own decision, which,
But he knows his people and his Congress. Congress wouldn't have let him get into such a quagmire, as you said, because they all remember the lessons of Vietnam or the Soviet experience in Afghanistan and President Bush in Afghanistan and Iraq. They know how wars start. They know that they may not be able to get out of it. So they would rather have a partial, a limited achievement rather than an all-out effort.
I would like also to touch another topic within this situation, of course. You referred earlier, Professor Bangio, with regarding to the Russian infiltration of 3 airplanes within the sovereign airspace of Turkey. Turkey did not respond. Nonetheless, we heard NATO, the general of NATO, come out with a declaration in which NATO will protect Turkey from everything. Is there any meat to this statement, or is it just another statement which has to be said for Turkey's purpose?
In the Pentagon computers, they have all of these formulas. When there is an incident or an accident, you can be sure that they will come out with a formula saying, our thoughts and prayers are with the victims and their families. If China or North Korea does anything in Asia, they will say that they will protect. If Russia does it to Turkey, they will say that they will protect. And they have Patriot missiles and all. Of course, they are not going to get into a renewed Cold War with Russia over Turkey. Erdogan has turned out to be the leader of a paper tiger.
All right.
And also to add,
we don't actually have much time. You have one sentence to say
just
what
one
you like.
sentence, that the Russian came to especially deployment was a kind of reaction to NATO's decision to be able to have attack from Incirlik from Turkey. So this is the connection. The Russians feared the involvement of the United States, of NATO, and that's why they decided to deploy them.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ofra Bangio. This is all the time that we have for today, but it's been very interesting to hear your input on the matter. Mr. Amir Oren, it's been a pleasure and also very interesting. And I'd like to thank our viewers, and we will see you next week. You just watched Jerusalem Studio. If you were enriched by the program, please consider supporting Heaven TV7 Jerusalem. Call us at 0600-10077 or send your donation using the bank account reference number on the screen. You can also donate via PayPal. Jerusalem Studio is made possible by your donation.